Earl Hutchins was 62 years old, and he had seen many strange things in his life, but nothing prepared him for what fell from the sky that autumn night. He sat on his porch in the Ozark Mountains, a place so remote that even the alien conquerors had forgotten it existed, and he watched the stars like he did every evening since his wife passed 3 years ago. The Velthari had come to Earth 18 months before, their massive ships blocking out the sun over every major city, and humanity had fallen in just 6 weeks, not because humans did not fight but because the aliens were simply too advanced, too powerful, too beyond anything Earth had ever faced. Now the world belonged to them. They had stripped away all modern technology from human hands, shut down the internet and the power grids, grounded all aircraft, and forced humanity back to farming and simple living, treating people like primitive creatures who needed to be managed and controlled. But Earl lived so deep in the forest that the Velthari scanners had marked his territory as low priority and left him alone, just an old man in a cabin with his tools and his memories and his stubborn refusal to die. He had been a marine mechanic in Vietnam when he was young, fixing helicopters and jeeps in conditions that would make most men quit. And after the war he came home and opened a repair shop where he spent 40 years fixing everything from tractors to muscle cars to lawn mowers. There was nothing mechanical that Earl could not understand if he spent enough time with it. The Velthari had scanned him during their initial sweep of the region, and their devices had labeled him non-threat, elderly manual laborer, before moving on to more important targets, and Earl had laughed at that because he knew that underestimating people was the first mistake any enemy could make. Tonight the sky was clear, and the stars were bright, and Earl was thinking about his wife Martha when he saw it. A streak of fire cut across the darkness, not like a shooting star but like something falling, something big, something that was trying to stay in the air but failing, and Earl stood up from his rocking chair and watched as the object crashed into the forest about 2 miles north of his cabin. The impact shook the ground beneath his feet. Orange light glowed above the tree line, and smoke began to rise into the night sky, and Earl knew exactly what had fallen because he had seen their ships before, those strange vessels that looked like they were grown rather than built, and he knew that going to investigate was probably the stupidest thing he could do. But Earl Hutchins had never been accused of being smart. He grabbed his flashlight and his walking stick and his old canvas bag of tools, and he started walking through the forest toward the crash site, moving slow because his knee was bad, and the terrain was rough but moving steady because that was how he did everything. It took him almost an hour to reach the clearing where the ship had come down. The vessel was smaller than the ones he had seen over the cities, maybe 40 feet long and shaped like a stretched teardrop, and its hull was cracked in several places with luminescent blue fluid leaking out onto the forest floor. The ship looked alive somehow, like a wounded animal rather than a broken machine, and Earl felt something in his chest that surprised him. He felt sorry for it. What Earl did not see were the 3 figures hidden in the ancient oak trees above the crash site, their skin shifting colors to match the bark and leaves around them, their large dark eyes watching his every move. These were not soldiers or workers. These were Velthari nobles, young lordlings from one of the great houses, and they had been on a hunting expedition in the mountains when their pilot made a critical error and sent them crashing into this primitive forest. The pilot was dead, his body crushed in the impact, and now the 3 young lords were stranded without any way to call for help, because the communication systems had been destroyed in the crash. The eldest was named Vaithra, and she was considered brilliant among her people, a future leader who was expected to rise high in the empire, and she watched the old human approach their sacred vessel with a mixture of disgust and curiosity. Her younger brothers Kale and Torvin flanked her on nearby branches, their chameleonic skin making them nearly invisible, and they waited to see what this primitive creature would do. They expected him to run away in fear. They expected him to fall to his knees and worship the alien technology. They expected him to do anything except what he actually did. Earl walked right up to the ship and started examining it like it was a broken-down truck on the side of the road. He circled the vessel slowly, playing his flashlight over the hull, noting the cracks and the damage and the places where the strange fluid was leaking out, and he clicked his tongue the same way he always did when a customer brought him a vehicle they had neglected for too long. "Well now," he said to nobody in particular, "somebody really did a number on you." The three Velthari in the trees exchanged glances of confusion. The human was talking to the ship. Earl pressed his ear against the hull and listened, something the Velthari had never seen anyone do, and he tapped his knuckles against different sections like a doctor checking for problems. "Still humming in there," he muttered, "so you are not dead yet, just hurting bad." Vaithra leaned forward on her branch, fascinated despite herself. Their ships were bonded to pilots through neural links, living vessels that responded only to their chosen masters, and when a ship was damaged, the Velthari would simply grow a new one, because the idea of repairing such sacred technology by hand was considered impossible and offensive. Yet this old human was examining their vessel like he intended to fix it himself. The idea was absurd. Kale made a soft sound that meant amusement among their kind, and Torvin responded with a gesture that meant, "Let us watch and see how the primitive fails." Earl found a seam in the hull that looked like it might open, and he pulled out his flathead screwdriver and worked it into the gap. And after a few minutes of patient effort, the panel popped free and revealed the strange organic machinery inside. "There we go," Earl said with satisfaction. "Now let us see what went wrong with you." He shined his flashlight into the opening and studied the alien technology with the same calm focus he had used on countless engines over the decades, seeing past the strangeness to find the patterns underneath, because every machine had patterns and every pattern could be understood. "I have seen worse," Earl said finally, and he meant it. Up in the trees, Vaithra felt something she had never experienced toward a human before. She felt the first small spark of respect. Earl came back at first light with a thermos of coffee and a notebook and a determination that had carried him through 70 years of life. The three Velthari had not moved from their positions in the trees, watching and waiting through the long night, unsure what to do without their ship and unwilling to reveal themselves to a primitive human who might panic or attack, or do any of the unpredictable things their briefing said humans did when confronted with their superiors. But the old man did not seem like the humans in those briefings. He walked into the clearing like he owned it, set down his thermos on a flat rock, opened his notebook, and got to work examining the crashed vessel with a focus that bordered on obsession. Vaithra watched him for hours as he moved around the ship, opening panels she did not know existed, studying components she had never seen exposed before, and taking notes in that primitive scratching language the humans used. She had been taught that humans were simple creatures driven by fear and greed, and the basic animal instincts that all primitive species shared. But this old man showed neither fear nor greed as he worked. He showed patience. He showed curiosity. He showed something that looked almost like love. "The crash did not kill you," Earl said to the ship around midday, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet forest. "You were already dying before you came down, were you not?" Kale made a sharp gesture of surprise from his branch. The human was correct. Their pilot had been arrogant and careless, a young noble who treated the ship like a possession rather than a partner, ignoring its warnings and pushing it beyond its limits, because he believed his status entitled him to do whatever he wished. The ship had been crying out for help for weeks, and nobody had listened. Nobody until now. Earl traced his fingers along the internal systems, following the pathways of luminescent tubes and organic circuits. And he stopped when he reached a component that looked something like a carburetor mixed with a heart. "This is where the trouble started," he said. "You've been running dry in here, burning yourself up because someone was too stubborn to stop and let you rest." He pulled out a small mirror from his bag and used it to see around corners inside the machinery, grunting with effort as he leaned into the access panel, his old body protesting but his mind sharp and focused. "Clogged up bad," he observed. "All this blue stuff should be flowing smooth, but it is gunked up like an engine that never got its oil changed." Vaithra felt a strange sensation that took her a moment to identify. She felt ashamed. Ashamed because a primitive human had diagnosed the problem with their sacred vessel in less than a day, while her own people would have simply discarded it and grown a new one without ever understanding what went wrong. The Velthari did not repair their ships. They commanded them. The ships were living things, yes, but they were living things that existed to serve, and when they broke down they were replaced because the idea of caring for them, of healing them, of treating them as something worthy of attention and effort was simply not part of Velthari thinking. But this old human sat in the dirt beside the wounded vessel and talked to it like a friend. "I know you are scared," Earl said softly, his hand resting on the warm hull. "Strange place, strange sounds. Your pilot gone and nobody around who speaks your language. But I am going to help you if you let me." Torvin made a sound of disbelief. The human thought the ship could understand him. But Vaithra was not so sure the human was wrong. She had studied the bond between Velthari and their vessels during her education, and she knew that the ships were more aware than most of her people admitted, that they had something like feelings and something like preferences and something like the ability to choose. What if the ship was listening? What if the ship was choosing? Earl stood up slowly, his knees cracking, and he stretched his back and looked at the vessel with the expression of a man who had made a decision. "I am going to need some parts," he said, "things from my shop that might work even though they were not made for you, and I am going to need you to trust me because what I am about to do is going to feel strange." He paused like he was waiting for an answer. The ship made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and a small panel near Earl's hand opened on its own to reveal a damaged component inside. Earl smiled. "All right then," he said, "we have a deal." Up in the trees, Vaithra felt the world shift beneath her. The ship had responded to the human. Not through a neural link. Not through genetic authorization. Not through any of the protocols and hierarchies that governed all Velthari technology. The ship had responded because it wanted to. Because it trusted him. Vaithra had been taught that trust was earned through dominance and demonstrated through submission, and she had accepted this teaching without question her entire life. But watching the old human and the wounded ship, she wondered if perhaps there was another way. Perhaps trust could be earned through kindness. Perhaps trust could be demonstrated through care. Perhaps the Velthari had been wrong about more than just this one old man. Earl gathered his notebook and his thermos, and he patted the ship's hull gently before turning to walk back through the forest toward his cabin. "Rest now," he said over his shoulder. "I will be back tomorrow and we will get you fixed up, I promise." The ship's lights flickered once in response. Vaithra watched the human disappear into the trees, and she turned to her brothers with an expression they had never seen on her face before. "We wait," she said. "We watch, we learn." Kale started to protest, but she silenced him with a gesture. "Something is happening here," Vaithra said. "Something that our teachers never told us was possible, and I want to understand it before we do anything else." Her brothers did not argue. They settled into their branches and prepared to observe. And somewhere in the damaged ship below, something that might have been hope began to stir. Earl returned the next morning, pushing an old wheelbarrow loaded with the strangest collection of objects the Velthari had ever seen. There were wrenches and screwdrivers and rolls of wire and tubes of strange paste that humans called grease. But there were also things that made no sense at all. A metal box covered in rust that had words stamped on it reading, Voltage Regulator 1967, Mustang. Coiled copper tubing from an old refrigerator. A pump mechanism pulled from the guts of a farming machine. Rubber rings that Earl had cut from old tires. Strips of silvery tape that seemed to stick to everything. A curved piece of metal that had once been the hood of an ancient vehicle, dented and weathered but still strong. Cale nearly fell from his tree in outrage when he realized what the human intended to do. He was going to put these primitive scraps inside their sacred vessel. He was going to defile Velthari technology with human garbage. Torvin shared his brother's horror and made the gesture that meant, "We should stop this now," but Vaithra held up her hand for silence. "Let him try," she whispered. "Let us see what happens." Earl unloaded his wheelbarrow and organized his supplies on a tarp he had brought, arranging everything with the careful precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. "All right," he said to the ship. "This is going to be uncomfortable for you and I am sorry about that, but sometimes healing hurts before it helps." He climbed partially inside the access panel, his legs sticking out as he worked in the confined space, and he began to do something that no Velthari would ever consider possible. He began to integrate human machinery with alien biotechnology. The first thing he did was clean out the clogged component, using solvents and brushes and compressed air from a small canister, working slowly and carefully to remove the built-up residue that had been choking the ship systems. "There now," he said, "already breathing better, are you not?" The ship made a sound that was almost like a purr. But cleaning was not enough because some of the damage was too severe, some of the components too degraded to function even when cleared of debris, and that was where Earl's junkyard parts came in. He studied the alien machinery for a long time, comparing shapes and sizes and connection points, thinking through the problem the way he had thought through countless problems over his decades as a mechanic. Then he picked up the voltage regulator from the Mustang and began to modify it. He bent metal and spliced wires and created adapters from copper tubing, building bridges between human technology and alien biology. And when he finally connected his creation to the ship systems, something remarkable happened. The lights inside the vessel flickered and then grew stronger. The component he had been working on began to pulse with renewed energy. The ship was healing. Vaithra watched in stunned silence as the human continued his work, piece by piece integrating his primitive parts into their advanced vessel, and each time he made a connection, the ship seemed to grow healthier. She did not understand how this was possible. Velthari technology was designed to reject foreign elements, to maintain its purity, to accept only what was grown specifically for it through carefully controlled biological processes. But the ship was not rejecting the human parts. The ship was accepting them. More than accepting, the ship was embracing them, wrapping its own biological systems around the metal and rubber, and wire like a body accepting a transplant, incorporating these foreign objects into itself and making them part of its own being. "Good job," Earl said, patting a section of hull. "You are tougher than you look." He worked for 3 days straight, sleeping only a few hours each night in a small tent he had set up near the crash site, eating simple food he had brought from his cabin, and talking constantly to the ship as he repaired and modified and improved. The Velthari watched every moment. They did not sleep. They did not eat. They simply observed as the impossible happened before their eyes. On the second day, Earl discovered that a large section of the hull was too damaged to heal on its own, cracked beyond what the ship's biological repair systems could handle, and he stood looking at the wound for a long time before nodding to himself. He retrieved the old Chevy hood from his wheelbarrow. "This is going to look ridiculous," he told the ship, but it will keep your insides on the inside, and that is what matters. He spent hours hammering and shaping the metal, cutting it with his tools, bending it to match the curves of the alien hull, and when he was satisfied, he began the process of attaching it to the ship. He used the sticky tape first, creating a temporary bond, and then he drilled small holes and used bolts and screws to secure the patch more permanently. And finally, he applied some kind of sealant around the edges to make the connection airtight. The ship's biological systems did the rest. As the Velthari watched in amazement, the alien tissue began to grow around the Chevy hood, sending tendrils of luminescent material across the metal's surface, bonding with it at a cellular level, making it part of the ship's own body. By the third day, the vessel was a hybrid creature, unlike anything that had ever existed. Velthari biotechnology fused with human steel and copper and rubber. Alien elegance merged with junkyard practicality. A spaceship with a Chevy hood for a patch, and a Mustang voltage regulator for a heart. It was ugly. It was absurd. It was beautiful. Almost done, Earl said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag that had seen better days. Just need to figure out how to get you started. Vathra knew he would fail at this final step. Without a neural-bonded pilot, the ship could not activate. Without genetic authorization from a recognized Velthari, the security systems would prevent any startup attempt. The old human had done remarkable things, but this was beyond remarkable. This was impossible. She almost felt sorry for him. She almost wanted to warn him. But she stayed silent and watched, and waited to see what would happen when the primitive human finally met a challenge he could not overcome. Earl looked at the ship's control systems and scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Going to need a workaround," he muttered, "because I sure as hell do not have whatever special handshake you are expecting." He disappeared into the access panel once more. And Vathra realized she was holding her breath. The fourth evening came with a cold wind from the north, and the smell of rain on the air, and Earl knew he had to finish tonight or risk losing everything to the weather. He had spent the entire day studying the ship's control systems, tracing circuits and pathways with his flashlight, trying to understand how the vessel was supposed to start, and why it refused to respond to any of his attempts. The problem was clear enough. The ship wanted authorization. It wanted a signal from someone it recognized, someone it trusted, someone who had the right to command it, and Earl was none of these things. He was just an old mechanic from the mountains. But Earl had been solving problems like this his entire life. He had hot-wired cars for people who lost their keys. He had bypassed security system on tractors that farmers had bought second-hand without documentation. He had started engines that their owners swore were dead, beyond any hope of resurrection. Every machine had a weakness. Every security system had a workaround. You just had to be patient enough and clever enough to find it. "You want someone you trust," Earl said to the ship, sitting beside it with his back against the hull. "And I understand that because trust is important, but the person you trusted is gone, and he was not good to you anyway." The ship made a soft humming sound. "I am not asking you to trust me the way you trusted him," Earl continued. "I am not asking for that bond or whatever it is you share with your pilots. I am just asking for a chance to prove I am on your side." The Velthari in the trees listened to every word. Vathra found herself leaning forward, invested in this strange conversation between human and machine, wanting to see what would happen even though she was certain she already knew the answer. The ship could not trust a human. The ship was not designed to trust a human. The ship was designed to serve the Velthari, and only the Velthari and no amount of kindness or care or clever mechanics could change that fundamental truth. Earl reached into his bag and pulled out something unexpected. It was a small device made from scavenged parts, A starter motor from a lawn mower connected to wires and switches that Earl had assembled over the past day, and it looked ridiculous next to the sleek alien technology of the ship. "Built you a key," Earl said, holding up the device. "Or something like one anyway. It is not pretty, but nothing I make ever is." He found a junction box inside one of the access panels, and he connected his homemade starter to the ship systems, splicing wires and making connections that should not have worked but somehow did. "Here goes nothing," he said, and he flipped the switch. The Velthari prepared to flee. Without proper authorization, the ship's security protocols would activate and anything could happen. Energy discharges or defensive mechanisms or emergency lockdowns that would trap the human inside. And none of them wanted to be nearby when the vessel rejected this intruder's pathetic attempt. But the security protocols did not activate. The ship hummed louder. Lights flickered across its hybrid hull, spreading from the jury-rigged starter through the repaired systems, illuminating the Chevy hood patch and the copper tubing vanes and the voltage regulator heart. The vessel was waking up. Kale made a sound of pure disbelief. Torvin actually fell from his branch, catching himself at the last moment with a desperate grab. Vaithra simply stared as the impossible unfolded before her eyes. The ship rose. Slowly, carefully, the wounded vessel lifted off the forest floor, hovering 3 feet in the air with a gentle hum that seemed almost joyful, its lights pulsing in patterns that Vaithra recognized as the ship's equivalent of a smile. Earl laughed out loud, a sound of genuine surprise and delight. "Well, I will be damned," he said. "You actually did it, you beautiful crazy thing." The ship floated there for a long moment, stable and strong despite everything it had suffered. And then Earl reached over and turned off his homemade starter, and the vessel settled gently back to the ground. It did not crash. It did not fall. It landed with perfect control, like a bird coming home to roost. "Save your strength," Earl said, patting the hull with obvious affection. "No need to show off, I believe you." Vaithra's mind raced as she tried to understand what she had just witnessed. The ship had not simply responded to the human's mechanical workaround. The ship had chosen to respond. The security protocols were still there, still active, still capable of rejecting any unauthorized user. But the ship had decided that this old human with his calloused hands and junkyard parts was authorized. The ship had decided to trust him. Not because of neural links or genetic keys or hierarchical protocols. Because he had cared for it. Because he had listened to it. Because he had treated it like something worthy of attention and effort and love. Vaithra thought about the pilot who had died in the crash, a noble from a prestigious family who had been given this ship as a coming-of-age gift and had treated it like a toy, pushing it too hard and ignoring its warnings, and never once considering that it might have feelings or needs or limits. She thought about the teachings of her people, the belief that technology existed to serve, and that the served owed nothing to the servants, that dominance was the natural order and kindness was weakness. She thought about the old human sitting in the dirt beside a vessel he had healed with scraps from a junkyard, talking to it like a friend, thanking it for trusting him. And she realized that her people had made a terrible mistake. Not just about this ship. Not just about this human. About everything. Earl lit a cigarette and sat smoking in the fatting light, watching the ship with an expression of quiet satisfaction. He had done what he set out to do. The vessel was repaired. The vessel could fly. His job was finished. But Vaithra knew with sudden certainty that something much larger had just begun. She looked at her brothers and saw the same confusion and uncertainty in their faces that she felt in her own heart. Everything they believed had just been proven wrong by one old man and one wounded ship, and they had no idea what to do about it. Earl was packing up his tools when the aliens came down from the trees. He heard them before he saw them, a soft rustling of leaves and the whisper of movement. And when he turned around, 3 tall figures were standing at the edge of the clearing, with their skin shifting colors like oil on water. They were beautiful in a terrifying way, 7 feet tall with slender limbs and eyes like black opals that reflected the moonlight, and any normal person would have run screaming into the forest at the sight of them. Earl just nodded. "Figured you were up there," he said, continuing to pack his wrenches into his bag. "You move quiet, but you smell like copper and ozone. Been catching whiffs of you since the first night." Vaithra stepped forward, her skin settling into a pale silver color that her people used when they wanted to appear non-threatening, and she studied the old human with new eyes. She had watched him for 4 days. She had seen him do impossible things. And now she was face to face with him, and he showed no fear at all. "You knew we watched," she said in broken English, a language she had learned from intercepted broadcasts during the invasion, "and still you worked." "Had a job to do," Earl said. "Did not matter who was watching." Kale and Torvin flanked their sister, their skin rippling with colors that indicated aggression and uncertainty, but Vaithra held up her hand to keep them calm. "This vessel," she said, gesturing at the hybrid ship with its Chevy hood gleaming in the moonlight, "it belongs to our house. It is property of our family, sacred technology that you have contaminated with your primitive materials." Earl shrugged. "It was dying," he said. "Now it is not. You are welcome." Vaithra did not know how to respond to this. In her world, the proper response to such a statement would be gratitude and submission, an acknowledgement that she had received a gift and now owed a debt. But she had never owed a debt to a human, and she was not sure the concept even applied. "The vessel will not serve us now," she said finally. "It has changed. It has bonded with your repairs. It has become something that is no longer purely Velthari." So it has chosen," Vaithra said, and the words felt strange in her mouth. "The vessel has chosen you." Earl stopped packing and looked at her with tired eyes that had seen too much in their 62 years. "Chosen me for what?" "To be its pilot, its partner, its bonded companion, the one it will serve and protect and carry among the stars." A long silence filled the clearing. The ship hummed softly behind Earl, its lights pulsing in a pattern that even the humans could recognize as hope. Earl looked at the vessel he had saved, this beautiful broken thing he had healed with junkyard parts and stubborn determination, and he felt something twist in his chest. "I am 62 years old," he said slowly. "I have arthritis in my hands, my knee is shot, my back hurts when it rains, and I have not been further than the county line in 15 years. He turned back to Vaithra. "What the hell am I supposed to do with an alien spaceship?" The question hung in the air between them. Vaithra tilted her head in a gesture she had learned indicated confusion among humans. "You do not wish to possess it." Earl laughed, a short, sharp sound without any humor in it. "Lady, I do not possess things," he said. "I fix them." He shouldered his bag of tools and picked up his walking stick and looked at the 3 aliens standing between him and the path home. "The ship is fixed," he said. "She can fly, she can heal, she can do whatever ships like her are supposed to do. My job is done." He started walking toward them, and they parted to let him pass, too stunned to do anything else, and he was almost into the trees when Vaithra called out. "Wait!" Earl stopped but did not turn around. "You saved our vessel," Vaithra said. "You healed something that our own people would have abandoned. You did the impossible with nothing but scraps and determination, and now you just walk away. That is the plan." "Why?" Earl finally turned to face her, and his expression was something Vaithra could not read, something ancient and weary and sad. "Because I am a mechanic," he said. "Not a pilot, not a warrior, not a savior. I fix things and then I move on to the next thing that needs fixing. That is who I am. That is who I have always been." He looked past her to the ship one last time. "Take care of her," he said. "Listen to her when she talks to you. Do not push her too hard, change her fluids regularly, and maybe next time she will not crash in some old man's forest." Then he walked into the darkness and disappeared. The three Velthari stood in the clearing for a long time after he left, silent and thoughtful, watching the hybrid ship pulse and hum like a creature dreaming of flight. Kale was the first to speak. "What do we do now?" Vaithra did not answer immediately. She was thinking about everything she had witnessed, everything she had learned, everything she had believed that had been proven wrong by one stubborn old human who refused to be impressed by anything including his own achievement. She walked to the ship and placed her hand on its hull, feeling the warmth of its life beneath her fingers, sensing the new elements that had been integrated into its being. The Chevy hood, the copper tubing, the Mustang voltage regulator, the love of a mechanic who asked for nothing in return. "We report what we have seen," Vaithra said finally. "Not to military command, not to our house, but to the science cast, to the scholars who study the nature of intelligence and bonding, and the mysteries our empire has never bothered to investigate." She turned to her brothers. "Our people conquered this world because we thought we understood it," she said. "We categorized these humans as primitives and assumed we knew everything worth knowing about them." She looked back at the forest where Earl had vanished. "We were wrong." That night Vaithra composed a message using the ship's restored communication systems, a message that would be transmitted to the highest levels of Velthari scholarship, a message that would eventually change everything. It contained only 2 words: reassess humanity. And somewhere in a cabin in the Ozark Mountains, an old mechanic with arthritic hands and a bad knee sat on his porch and watched the stars. He did not know what he had started. He did not know that his simple act of kindness and competence would ripple outward through an alien empire like a stone, dropped in still water. He only knew that somewhere out there was a ship he had saved, a vessel he had healed, a creature made of light and metal and hope that was flying again, because one stubborn old man had refused to let it die. Earl Hutchins smiled and sipped his coffee and thought about his wife Martha and the life they had shared. "Hell of a week," he said to nobody in particular. And in the sky above, the stars seemed just a little bit brighter than before.